If in the first century Judea, there was a guy named Bob, and Bob said that he loved grapes and that grapes were the best thing in the entire planet. And then for the next 2,000 years, Bob's ideas about grapes dominated the planet. Everyone was building grape factories, grape drink everywhere. Everyone could just only talk about grapes all the time. Grapes were informing the morals of every human who lived after Bob. You know what? Maybe I don't believe in Bob, but I definitely want to study him. And that's the predicament of modern academia. Welcome to the Berean Brotherhood. My name is Lee. I'm one of your hosts with my brother Dave. We're here to talk today about the historical credibility of the resurrection of Jesus. One thing we think you should always find credible, though, are the like and subscribe buttons down below. Hit those like and subscribe buttons, help increase our credibility, our clout, our social swag, and help us to just increase the credibility and promoting the gospel of Jesus Christ. Thank you for joining us. Today, we're going to talk about literally the most important event that has ever occurred in human history. Even if I weren't religious or devout as a Christian, even if I had absolutely no belief whatsoever in the supernatural element of Jesus' life, death, and resurrection, the resurrection of Jesus is the most fascinating historical event ever. There's just no other person, no other human being, man or woman, no king, no tyrant, no emperor, no priest, no elite royal member of society, no impoverished wise sage somewhere. There's literally no one who has hit society on all the levels and at the depth that Jesus Christ has hit it with his resurrection. There are 2.4 billion Christians on the planet in 2025. There are 1.9 billion Muslims on the planet who also hold Jesus to be one of the holiest prophets. That's a combined 4.3 followers of Jesus Christ on the planet today, 4.3 billion people. And the central cornerstone of that for most of these believers is the resurrection of Jesus. Was it an actual historical event that occurred? Was it just mythological, superstitious, blah, blah? We're going to get to the heart of it in this episode. So, four of the main points we're going to go through are: one, the post-mortem appearances of Jesus and the empty tomb. Two, the scholarly standards of what defines mythology and how the resurrection of Jesus completely crushes any claims of mythology. Three, the historical credibility of Jesus' claims as a founder of Christianity versus the religious claims of other founders and the differences between scientific and historical angles on each of them. And fourth, the historical uniquity of the resurrection, the absolutely distinct impact that the resurrection has had on 2,000 years of history following it.
The resurrection of Jesus is the cornerstone of Christianity, but the question is it historically credible? While there's no smoking gun where historians and scholars point to different multiple evidences together, that we can build a compelling case. And today I want to share more about the empty tomb and the historical claims. Number one is mentioned in all four of the Gospels that the tomb was found empty. The first witnesses were women, and it was a culturally inconvenient detail that was an unlikely event to be invented by the people who were retelling the story. And early Jewish responses with Roman Empire, the way that they responded, they never denied that the tomb was empty. They just made claims that the body was stolen. So indirectly, they were telling us that the tomb was empty. The question is, maybe what if they went to the wrong tomb? But that's unlikely because Joseph of Arimathea, his tomb was actually known. And the fact of the question of was his body stolen, it would be something that terrified the disciples, because why would all of them then die for a lie? Producing the body would have been the most convenient thing for the Jewish authorities, for the Roman authorities, and even for the disciples, because they wouldn't have had to go through everything that they went through. And then right after that, we see the historical claims of the post-mortem appearances, which we see in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verses 3 through 8. And we see that the creeds were created because of that, which is basically stating that Jesus appeared to Peter, James, and John, to all of the 12 disciples or apostles, and to over 500 people at once. And Paul says most of them are still alive as he was writing the letters to each of the churches.
Yeah, and to somebody listening to that and saying, well, it's circular reasoning. You can't prove the Bible by referring to the Bible. Don't worry. We got a bunch of extra biblical sources as well. But this is a fundamental mistake. Outside of the freshman at your college, your local college, who just came out of Philosophy 101 and just discovered that because his mom and dad are not going to pay for his furry squirrel costume, he thinks his mom and dad hate him. Just because that guy thinks that the Bible is just a collection of mythological books does not mean that that's what the scholarship in academia think about with the Bible. The Gospels are considered Greco-Roman biographies. That is to say that the style that most scholars, Christian and non-Christian, believe are that these Gospels are ancient biographies witnessed by independent eyewitness accounts of Jesus' life, death, and possible resurrection, and people who firsthand knew the witnesses. Which means that if you look at the New Testament as just one book, then it's easy to say, well, a follower of Jesus could have easily written this. But the historical consensus is that these were independently developed testimonies and biographies of the life, death, and actions of Jesus after his death. Now, the scholarship is not endorsing the supernatural events of Jesus' ministry, but this is an important point to establish because remember, we just take in ancient history that people existed because the scholars say so. Alexander the Great, the best evidence we have for Alexander the Great was written 260 years after his death, while all of the Gospels and historical biographies about Jesus from inner biblical sources were written within 20, 30, 40 years of Jesus' death. They were all written within the lifetimes of the disciples and their contemporaries. Don't let people for a second tell you that the Bible is not an archaeological or historical source. That is completely false. That is not how the scholarship views it. That is how your freshmen at the community college view it. That is not how the scholarship views it whatsoever. That does not mean that academia endorses the supernatural identity of Jesus, but they absolutely view the Gospels, at least, as biographical accounts of the life of Jesus. Which leads to our second point. Were these biographical accounts mythologized? Well, yeah, Lee and David, of course his believers wrote these biographies, but then they gave him a little magic. They gave him a little woo-ju. They gave him a little woo-zoo, and then he started raising dead people and splitting bread and walking on water. And again, we're referring to the historical standard that scholars use. Mythology to me and David could just mean, hey, I like dragons. But scholars have very specific criteria for how they assess whether or not an ancient work was mythologized. One of the most important factors that they use is time. Jesus' account and the life of his followers and the immediate explosion of Christianity in first century Judea means it did not have the time to mythologize the way most historians would give other myths credit for doing. So we have a bunch of extra biblical sources about this that prove that as soon as Jesus died, accounts of his resurrection were instantaneous. They spread all throughout the region. They infected Roman guards. They infected emperors. It went into cities. You even had Emperor Nero blaming the Great Fire of Rome back in the first century on first century Christians. So obviously this wasn't something that took 400 years to occur. One of the best extra biblical sources we have is Publius Cornelius Tacitus. He's known simply as Tacitus in history. He was a Roman historian and politician. He was a senator in Rome. So this was the farthest thing from a Christian you could possibly have. And in his books, The Annals and Histories, where he recorded a bunch of the lives of the emperors of Rome, including Tiberius, Claudius, and Nero, he mentions Jesus. He mentions the execution of Jesus by the Roman prefect Pontius Pilate. This is not the Bible. This is a Roman senator mentioning these things. He mentions that the resurrection account, or a most mischievous superstition, a magical superstition that these Christian followers in Rome were beginning to adhere to and that were showing up in massive large numbers, hundreds if not thousands of people. Again, these are not the disciples. We're not getting this news from christianpropaganda.net. This is a Roman senator saying that there were large swaths of the population that were already Christians in 60 AD. This is not how mythology works. Another source that we have is Pliny the Younger. He was the Roman governor of Bithynia and Pontus, what we would consider modern day Turkey. And he wrote a letter to another emperor named Trajan around AD 110. And he was basically asking for advice because he was like, how do we deal with these Christians? They're like aliens. We've never seen anything like it. They believe in this resurrection of Jesus. They just show up. And then, of course, you had the Roman historian Suetonius, who wrote the biography of Emperor Claudius. It's known as the Divius Claudius 25. And the exact line from his work is, since the Jews constantly made disturbances at the instigation of Christus, what scholars believe to be the name of Christ, he expelled them from Rome. And we see in Acts 18:2, direct quote, that Paul found a Jew named Aquila, a man of Pontus by race, lately come from Italy with his wife Priscilla, because Claudius had commanded all the Jews to depart from Rome, and he came onto them. The book of Acts is telling us as a biographical, historical, biblical source that the Jews were expelled by Claudius, and that's how they met Paul. And we have ancient Roman historians saying the exact same thing. These people never met. They probably didn't even speak the same language. They were in completely different income classes, political classes, social classes, and they're all confirming this resurrection account. A bunch of Jews are coming out of nowhere saying that this guy resurrected from the dead, basically, and now hundreds, if not thousands, of people are believing in it. This is anti-mythical to the core. This is not how myths work. Myths take decades and decades and centuries to evolve and form and to organically mutate. There are no major religions in the world that have instantaneously sprung up like this.
I remember the first time going into Naya College, taking an introduction to Christianity course, and for the first time ever, I heard an apologetical argument for the resurrection of Jesus Christ.
Mm,
And my mind was blown because for most of my walk in Christianity, I was just told there's no way to prove this is solely by faith,
right.
faith alone,
Blind
and
faith.
yeah, blind faith. And
Right.
finally, I can say, wait a minute, there's historical documents, archaeological evidence to give us and point us to the direction. And when it comes to historical evidences, this is all based on archaeological findings of documents, eyewitness accounts, artifacts, things that are happening, battles, banquets, or assassinations, or things like an empty tomb or the crucifixion of Jesus Christ. We believe that Julius Caesar was assassinated, even though we haven't seen it today, and no one alive today has seen it, but historically, we have enough evidence from things that were documented at the time to know that there was a person named Julius Caesar and that he was assassinated. What I will say is that no matter what religion you are part of, I want to encourage you to look at the claims that that religion is making. The resurrection of Jesus Christ is the cornerstone of our faith as Christians. When you look at Islam and the Prophet Muhammad, he died in 632 AD. He was buried in Medina, Saudi Arabia, and his tomb is well known and is visited by millions. And Islam does not claim that Muhammad ever resurrected. When you go into Buddhism and Buddha died around 400 BC. He was cremated. All of his relics were divided among his followers, and there was no resurrection claim in his teachings. And when it comes to Hinduism, all of the various gods like Krishna and Rama, all of these are divine incarnations, but they are more of symbolic and mythical interpretations, not actual historical events with verifiable tombs or witnesses. We have the backing and the archaeological proofs in the different museums around the world that we can see for ourselves. This is how we can have an assurance of the faith that we have.
So it's not like other religions where you go and you say, well, these things happen. And they say, well, you just got to take it on faith that Zeus is on top of Mount Olympus. You can go back right now and you can look at the Masoretic book of Isaiah, which is the medieval European version of the book of Isaiah. You can take that book today. You can go to the museum if you know the language, and you can go and read that book right now in 2025. And you can go and read the Dead Sea Scrolls, which predates the Masoretic Isaiah book by 1,000 years. And you can read both versions of those texts and see that they're the exact same book. There is no difference whatsoever. Over millennia, these texts and manuscripts are preserved at a, shall I say it, miraculous level of preservation. And it's not just one text that's preserved in this way. The New Testament is found on over 5,800 complete or fragmented Greek manuscripts. There are 10,000 Latin manuscripts, 9,300 manuscripts in various other ancient languages like Syriac, Slavic, Gothic, Ethiopic, Nubian, Armenian. There are literally thousands and thousands of these manuscripts that repeat the exact same passages. 99.9% of that variety and difference is in grammatical errors. It's not in the content of the passages. So where other religions will tell you, well, just take it on faith that Muhammad, he was a warmonger who forged all of the biblical texts and used it to expand his political power in a region. He died. But you know what? Just take it on faith that he's a prophet. Christianity will tell you, go back, look at the thousands of texts yourself, learn the languages, read it. To quote Frank Turek, a great apologist, if you guys are ever interested in checking him out on YouTube, he said something very interesting. What he said was, the New Testament writers did not invent the resurrection. The resurrection invented the New Testament writers, which means that before the Council of Nicaea and all of these church affiliated institutions came together and canonized the Bible and put together all these manuscripts like Q source and Luke source and the letters of Paul, before any of that happened, Christians were already converting in the thousands and thousands before they even had a canonized text together, which means that the New Testament writers were inspired by some unique historical event that blows the mind, that even the biggest non-religious critic has to admit something happened in first century Judea that sparked a revolution and lit the world on fire. And they didn't have an organized Bible at the time to make that happen.
And in the Watergate scandal, they broke to save themselves.
Right.
The apostles, they all suffered and died without recanting, without taking back the claim that they saw the resurrected Jesus.
The final evidence we're going to present for this episode, historical uniquity of the resurrection, which means the distinct historical place without rival that the resurrection has in history, which means if somebody claims something, we usually measure the credibility of that claim by the effect. So, for example, David says he's stronger than me, and I arm wrestle David, and my arm snaps like a twig. This is a good piece of evidence to establish that David is possibly stronger than me. If somebody makes a messianic claim, for example, like the dozens and dozens of messiahs that have appeared throughout the world, who say they're going to change the world, they're going to resurrect from the dead, and they're going to do all these things, and then they're killed or they die and nothing happens, well, that's a good point of reference for the credibility of their claim. But Jesus' death and resurrection is the preeminent historical event. The Gregorian calendar is literally based, BC and AD, on the birth, death, and life of Jesus. Like, time and calendars are literally split because of him. Western civilization, which we credit for all our ideals and all of our philosophies and the development of the modern world, was based on Enlightenment thinking in the 17th and 18th century. And Enlightenment thinkers were fundamentally built from the ground up on the ethics, reasoning, and ideologies of Christian tradition. The scientific revolution, with the greatest scientists to ever live, Galileo, Isaac Newton, Robert Hooke, John Meridian, Nicole Orsman, Roger Bacon, Nicholas Copernicus, Johannes Kepler, Blaise Pascal, Robert Boyle, the list is endless. All of the founding fathers of these Western philosophies of ethics, all of these founding fathers of the Enlightenment, of the scientific revolution, were all men and women who believed in the resurrection of Christ. It was that resurrection that they believed in that inspired them to think that the natural universe was designed by a creator and was sustainable in a way where humans could experiment and interpret it. That's the entire foundational belief behind science. From the 4th century all the way to the 12th century, the modern university, as you know it, was formed by monasteries with monks and nuns who took that resurrection belief as a responsibility to educate others, who eventually formed the primordial form of the university. Literacy itself, the fact that you can even read and you have all this knowledge available to you, was inspired by Johannes Gutenberg and the invention of the printing press. The printing press enabled thousands, if not millions and billions of people to access information that used to be restricted only for the elites. And do you know what the first major published work in Europe and probably in the entire world that was mass produced was? It was the Gutenberg Bible, based on the Latin Vulgate Bible. So yes, Johannes Gutenberg wanted to make some money with his printing press, but he was an established devout Catholic, and he thought it was his responsibility to share the gospel with other people.
Lee, you mentioned education, and the first universities were actually seminaries.
Right.
Oxford, Cambridge, Harvard, all of them were founded by Christians to train leaders and to teach scripture.
Right.
So, with the education and literary things, these mass movements that were happening was also a race and the desire to read the word of God.
Even today, 21st century modern secular ethics, when somebody tells you, well, Christians are evil, where do you think they got that idea from? It's just common sense. We just know it's common sense that some things are good and some things are bad, and you don't need Jesus and you don't need the resurrection. It's just common sense. Do you know what common sense was for the Aztec priests back in Central America and South America thousands and thousands of years ago? Common sense was cutting open me, so to take my heart and offer it to the sun god so that we would have a great crop. But common sense, even for non religious people today, is inspired by the resurrection of Christ, because it's the resurrection of Christ that created the ideologies, that created the thinkers, that created the Western civilization, that created the ethics that you now assume are common sense. We have to help the underprivileged. We have to help the poor. We have to defend the defenseless. We have to be charitable. Where do you think those ideas came from? You are a 21st century citizen of a city in a Western country. All of the ideas that you assume are common sense are nothing more than the cultural residue, Judeo Christian beliefs based on the resurrection over thousands of years, which you have now mistaken to think you innately had from the start.
This set up the groundwork for abolition movements, humanitarian aid, modern concepts of equality and justice. And these are just some examples of how the idea that every person is made in the image of God, Genesis
Right.
chapter 1, verse 27, influenced the development of the human rights movement that we have.
And again, we have to reiterate this as we wrap it up. This is not Christian propaganda. This is neutral, secular history. This is all established. Francis Bacon was an invention of the church. Isaac Newton wasn't an invention of the church. These are men and women who came and decided that they had a bigger responsibility to humanity because of the responsibility they felt indebted to through Christ and his sacrifice. I would challenge you, if you're not a believer, to just consider the simpler explanation that something extremely important, perhaps the most important event of all time, occurred 2,000 years ago in a little town in the middle of nowhere with a bunch of people who had no name, and it completely warped and flipped the world on its head to create the world that we now see. And maybe sometimes the simplest explanation is a truth, that Christ actually did resurrect, and that the resurrection is the best historical explanation for all the facts we've presented.
For me, the biggest historical impact that it's had on the world is that millions of lives have been transformed. I would
Amen.
even say billions, right? Because
Billions,
from the
100%.
time from the resurrection to now, billions of lives have been radically transformed, radically changed, and they are the living evidence and proof that something occurred, time itself changed, and we are also participating in that movement, lives being transformed, radically having encounters that have changed their lives. Everyday people, no matter what social class they were a part of, were impacted by the truth of the gospel message. And that's what we know to this day. Lives are still being transformed. And we hope that you hear the effectual call to salvation and that you receive Jesus as well. God bless you all. Thank you for watching. Make sure you like and subscribe. Peace out.